Denial of Death by Ernest Becker is one of my favorite books of all time. It basically argues that all of us are deeply, deeply driven by the fear of death. At some point when we're really young, we understand that our physical body, our physical self, is going to die one day. It's going to disappear. It's not going to be here anymore. However, our conceptual self, who we are, our name, our accomplishments, our achievements, what we were known as, that can live on much longer than our physical self. And so a lot of our life is dedicated to creating these things that Ernest refers to as immortality projects. Essentially, this is things where we, might try to have a road named after us. We might try to have a building named after us. We want to achieve lots of success and wealth and have that success and wealth be documented by other people and remembered by other people. We deeply want other people to know who we are, to have a good idea of, who we are, and to remember us so that our conceptual self stays alive. This is why we care so much about what other people think in a lot of different ways. This is why we are extremely preoccupied with achieving success, achieving status or fortune for some people. This is what drives a lot of our actions. This is also what drives us to numb, to use substances, to use alcohol, to use drugs in order to not feel this intense, overwhelming pressure and fear that one day we're going to die and that everything that we've done may be completely forgotten. This is at the root of a lot of problems. Of course, it's not the only thing, that's there. There's lots of other aspects as well, but it's an incredibly important aspect of everyone's life is this idea of death and the fact that death will come to us one day and it could potentially erase us forever. It's something that's extremely hard for a lot of people to grapple with and to understand. And this is why people who are able to successfully deny death, who are able to be immortal by having their conceptual self live on well past themselves, are so celebrated. We always celebrate people like, Vincent van Gogh or Galileo or Newton, people who have died centuries ago, but their names still live on as household names. We celebrate these people. We prize them, people who are able to succeed and who are able to have successful immortality projects. And we all try to aim to be like them in some way or another, to do a good job, to do well in life, and to move forward so that we can be remembered. And if we're not doing these things, we may engage in forms of denial. Like I mentioned before, we may use drugs in order to numb that pain, to numb that feeling, because we believe that we're not enough. We're never going to be able to create an immortality project. We're never going to be able to succeed for whatever reason. Like people may have told us these things, experiencing abuse. All these things can lead to this belief that you can never actually create an immortality project, that you will be forgotten, that your life is not of any value. That drives a lot of people to substances, to numbing, to denial, to feeling like they can never achieve anything. This is what leads to a lot of existential crises sometimes, is where you feel like you kind of get to your mid-30s and you realize like you will be forgotten. No one's going to remember you. You can't at this point in your life really turn things around successfully. That's a terrifying thing to grapple with, is that all the success, all the fortune, all the, anything that you achieve, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. You can have everything and you will still be forgotten. Death is still waiting there, looming around the corner. And so in this video, what I want to do is I want to tackle this idea of death, to talk about it and apply a Buddhist perspective to it, and share a kind of insight and understanding that I have of death that has really helped me grapple with this feeling a lot more and not have this fear of death drive my life forward so much. So this video is going to be kind of broken up into two parts. Now that we understand what death is, why it's important, and why it drives so much of our lives, I want to talk about just how death isn't really real. Death is not something that we need to be so preoccupied with. So in the first part of this video, I'm going to break down what I mean, why I feel that death is not really real, quote unquote. And, it's not going to be, it's difficult for me to explain now what I mean when I say death isn't real, but as we talk about it, you'll understand what I mean when I say that. And in the second part of the video, we're going to go over practical applications. Like how can you use this insight of like death not really being real and apply it to your real life. So what do I mean? First, let's talk about what do I mean when I say death isn't real? What I mean by this is it's difficult to explain, but we can kind of start in an unrelated place. So let's say that you eat an apple. The question you have to ask yourself is, at what point does the apple stop being an apple and become you? If you tracked every single cell in that apple and watched someone as they ate it, at what point do the cells in the apple become your cells? Because if you think about it, all of our skin, all of our bones, all like everything here is made up of food. We consume food, and that food becomes transformed into us, into fat, into skin, into hair, all of these things. So how and at what point exactly does the apple no longer become a separate apple and become us? And if you think about that long enough, the logical conclusion becomes there is no point where the apple becomes us, because it's so subjective. It's not really real, that idea of like the apple eventually becomes us at like this point in the digestion process, because you can argue at any point in the digestion process the apple becomes us, and there is no objective truth of like, oh, the apple does become us at XYZ point, because someone else can argue otherwise. The logical conclusion, if you think about it long enough, is just that you are never separate from the apple. There is no separation, and that separation makes no sense. It is useful, to think of the apple as separate, and it's like a good kind of conceptual way to just see reality, to make it a little easier to grapple and understand, but it's not actually reality itself. We, for so long, have used this idea of the self and this, things are separate from the self in order to understand and grasp reality better, that we're kind of confusing the map for the real world, where we think that this conceptual, just like, thing that makes things more convenient, where we're like, okay, this is an apple, it's separate from us, we consume it. The apple is not really separate from us. There is no separation between you, the apple, to any other food, and to any other being, really. So that's the first piece that you got to understand, is that, the apple, there is no point in that process where you're eating an apple where you actually are separate from the apple. You have always been one with the apple. And so when you think of this, you can start to extend this idea to other things. Once you accept this kind of idea that, and again, I'm not saying it's completely true. This is just my perspective. It's the way I like to see things. And if you disagree, I completely think that's valid. This is just one way to see things. So if you accept that idea and you agree that there is no separation between you and the apple, you can kind of start to get some interesting conclusions from that. One of the conclusions that really struck me, and this is where I kind of got that idea that death is not real, is when I was looking at a tree, and I thought, if I died and I was buried underneath that tree, just the same way that I consume an apple and that apple becomes me, if I am below that tree will use, my body as its nutrients, and I will become that tree. And so that in itself was a cool realization, that there is no difference between us and nature. But then I took it a step further. What if I was buried underneath an apple tree, and my body, my dead body, became part of that tree, and that tree produced an apple that another human being ate? And that's when I started to realize there is no such thing as a self, and there's no such thing as death, because you aren't really dying when you die. When you become dead, you just fuel more life. It's not really a like thing where it's like life ends once you die. Death is just a part of life, and death in that sense isn't really real the way we think of death. That insight and that understanding was really, really helpful for me, because I realized, if you think about the billions of humans who have died before us, they never really died. They're still here. They're still around in that sense, because they're not really like death just doesn't make sense as a concept when you start to think of it like that, because you're not really dying. You're just morphing into something else. You're just taking another form. That's all it is. And that makes death a lot scarier in and of itself. And it also starts to highlight and illuminate the idea of a no self, of the fact that us being separate from other things doesn't make any sense. Because if you think about it, like if you die, you become that tree, but buried under a tree, you become that tree. At what point do you stop being a human, like a dead human body, and become that tree? There is no point, where like you can really concretely argue that you are no longer like a human body to a tree. And same thing again with the apple. When you start to think about this and just logically follow the conclusions that come about from this idea that like you and the apple are no longer separate, and that you and the apple are one, you realize everybody is one. Because us, like humans from the past who have died, they have provided basically nutrition to a lot of the trees, a lot of the plants. Those plants have provided nutrition to animals, animals that we consume. We it all kind of is connected. We are all one. Everyone who lived before us, everyone who lived after us, we are going to be one with them. And that becomes very relieving in a sense, because for me at least, I realize like death is not something you need to be concerned about, because death, the way that we think of it as a hard stop, as an ending, does not make any sense. Death isn't really a sad or a terrible thing in the way that we think of it. It is just a continuation of life. And of course, death is extremely difficult to deal with in real life. I'm not saying this to minimize, anyone who has experienced death. Death is painful and terrible in a lot of different ways. However, hopefully this understanding of death can even give some comfort to realize that, if you have lost someone, they are still living on, just in a different form. At least for me, that gives me some comfort when I think about that. The people who are dead, who are no longer here, are still living on. They're alive. They're just no longer in the same form that we are. And so that idea really, really helps to break down lots of different things. Yeah, for one, you realize like death isn't as scary of a thing anymore. And you also realize that the idea of union, of being one with everything, becomes so much easier to understand. It becomes an obvious conclusion, because you realize that, like if you and the tree and the apples that you eat, everything is just kind of made up of the same stuff. There is no difference between you and everything else. It's kind of like the way you can think of it is like the whole universe is just one big living, breathing organism. And you are just a like functional part of that organism. There is no separation between you and anything else. Everything just is one. So this, in my opinion, cool idea. And it really resonated with me when I realized it. And it brought together a lot of Buddhist teachings, like, no self, being deathless, all of this stuff. So now we move into the more kind of practical part of the video. So once you kind of can get down with this idea that death is not real, that death, at least in the way that we think of it, that we don't cease to exist once we die, it becomes a lot easier to tackle emotional problems and difficulties that you may run into. Then the second more kind of practical part of this video, we can talk about how you can apply this to your day-to-day life. So this is just some of the ways that you can apply them, but these are the ways that have been most helpful for me. So the first kind of thing that it was very helpful for me was with anxiety, with intense feelings of fear, and feeling like I need to do more, that I need to be better, that I need to be doing things more perfectly, more optimally. I need to reach perfection. Things need to be better. I need to, just constantly push myself. And I always had this invisible pressure barreling down on me, kind of forcing me to push myself beyond the point of, like burnout and stuff like that. For a lot of people who are, extreme perfectionists, or a lot of people who deal with lots of anxiety, this idea of death is always very prominent. You're very aware that one day you're going to die, and you have this scarcity kind of mindset of like, I'm going to die one day, so I need to get everything together right now. And this, comes from a lot of different things, from childhood, from things that you've experienced, from trauma, all that stuff. But in my opinion, at least, the way that I see it, the way that's been helpful for me to understand it, is that with anxiety, your fear of death that everyone has is just turned up to 11. For a lot of people I've met with anxiety, for me, myself, I'm very aware that one day I'm going to die. And whenever I do anything, I think about like, or if I'm like, hesitant to do something, I'll think about like on my deathbed, will this be something that I like will wish that I would have done? And that always pushes me to do things that, I'm kind of scared of doing, or pushes me to work harder, to, go farther in life, stuff like that. So this idea of, death pushing us, driving our anxiety, it's kind of obvious if you think about it, like how this idea of deathlessness can really apply here. Because the issue with anxiety, some anxiety is great. Some anxiety is super helpful. A manageable amount of anxiety can actually be super productive, because it can push you to do things that you wouldn't normally do. If you have a job and you want that job, you're afraid of losing that job, and that fear might push you to do a good job, to do a little bit better at work, and to put in hours when you sometimes don't feel like putting them in, because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't. So that fear can be very useful, but with anxiety, fear gets to the point where it's no longer useful. It is so overwhelming, it takes over your life, and you can no longer function well because your fear paralyzes you, or it forces you to do things that don't really align with your values. You're just doing things kind of for the sake of doing them because you're afraid of missing out. Like hoarding is a good example, where you'll just hoard tons of stuff because you're afraid of, like, oh, what if I need this one day? What if this, needs to be around? And in extreme cases, this hoarding can, lead to lots of problems. It can also just force you to do things that you don't really want to do. It can feel forced to take on career opportunities that you don't really want to. You can feel like forced to do things that you don't really want to do. And people pleasing shows up a lot, where like people will ask you to do something, and out of fear, you'll kind of say yes because you're afraid that people will leave you. You'll be alone, and you'll die alone. And so all of this can very, very I won't say easily, but it can very much so be combated with this idea of deathlessness. Because in my opinion, a lot of that pressure is just pressure that comes from this fear of death being turned up to the max. So when you understand this idea of deathlessness, that there is no such thing as death, that you're just going to kind of move forward in life. It doesn't make sense really to be afraid of death. There is no separation between you and other people. You feel this strong sense of a union. That fear of death no longer is barreling down on you, because you realize that there is no fear. What is there to be afraid of? Once you really fully can understand and internalize this, you can just move forward a lot more freely. For me, when I had this realization, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I realized I don't need to do all these things. I don't need to be perfect. I don't need to get everything done right now, right away, and to make the most of every single moment and make sure that everything is perfect and going well. I can just be. I can just move forward and just experience life as it is, and kind of see life coming at me, and just accept it. It becomes a lot easier to accept things because you don't have this pressure to do the best that you possibly can, to make the most of life and everything like that. And ironically, that helps you make the most of life. When you no longer have this pressure to make the most of life, you're able to actually make the most of life a lot more easier. You're able to accept difficult things a lot more. You're able to do the things that you truly want to do, because again, anxiety forces you to do things that you don't really want to do, like people pleasing, taking on too many responsibilities, doing too many things, feeling like you're not enough. A lot of these things start to go away when it's like you don't need to be afraid anymore. You don't need to do the best possible thing anymore. You just can be yourself. You can be alive, because death isn't a real tangible thing. It's just something we've made up in our mind that's very useful for evolutionary purposes, because that fear of death drives you to do so much, to innovate, to become better, to have kids, all of these things. But it's not real. And when you can let go of that idea of like death being a definitive period, a definitive hard stop to your life, you can be so much more free. You can do the things you want to do. You don't feel pressured to take on things that that you don't really want to do. You can let go of a lot of perfectionism, because you don't need to do the best possible way of doing things. This is just one kind of phase of an ever-evolving life. Life never really ends. Life just continues on in different forms. That becomes a lot less stressful, at least in my opinion. So that's one practical way you can apply it, is to anxiety. Is once you have this deep core understanding that there is no such thing as death, that it's just a continuation of life truly. Once you kind of understand that idea of the apple becoming part of you, and then you becoming the part of the tree, and all this stuff, and being connected to everyone, it becomes so much easier to deal with that fear, that anxiety, at least in my opinion. And so the second part I want to talk about, the practical applications of this, are with empathy and with loneliness. So loneliness is something that we all feel. Loneliness is extremely difficult to deal with. I've had lots and lots of bouts of loneliness. However, this realization really helps with loneliness, especially if you're an emotionally sensitive person. If you're someone who, gets riled up really easily, like I'm extremely emotionally sensitive. And it's really hard for me to deal with the intense emotions that I have. It's hard for me to find emotional connections, because when you're emotionally sensitive, if you've read the book Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, when you're emotionally sensitive, you have really high emotional needs. And so you are very prone to feeling lonely, because you rarely get your needs met, because other people are not as emotionally sensitive as you. So this idea of deathlessness can actually be really helpful here, because if you think about it, it becomes a lot harder to feel lonely when you have this deep understanding and intuitive knowledge of like, we are all one. There is no separation between me and other people, because again, if you think about it, like all of the trees that are here now, all of the nature, all of that was, just like people who lived here before us, like they were used as nutrients to fuel the trees, the plants that are here now that fuel us. And then we are going to do the same thing later on. And so that you lose that separation of yourself and other people. You no longer feel like there's a you and then there's other people, because that doesn't make sense anymore. Like everything is one. It's all just one, like living organism that we're all a part of. We're all together and we are all part of a single cohesive unit. That makes it a lot harder to be lonely, in my opinion. I still get lonely. I'm not saying it's going to cure your loneliness, but in those times of loneliness, when I feel that crippling loneliness, that fear, I can remind myself that it's okay. Like I am one with everything. Like I truly sink back into that deep meditative place. I feel myself being at one with everything, and it fills that emotional void that I have sometimes, and it'll help me feel connected, and this in turn helps you sympathize with people a lot better, because when you let go of this idea that you are separate from other people, you understand how everything is one. You stop feeling so kind of claustrophobic and centered in yourself and so separate from other people. You no longer have it, you still will, of course, but it becomes a little bit easier to have these ideas of like, or to not have these ideas of like, oh, I'm worse than everyone else, or I'm better than everyone else. Other people don't understand me, because you realize everyone is one, everything is one. So you no longer feel this like deep separation from other people. You can really sit down and empathize with them, because you realize, like you are one with the other person. There is no separate you and them. There's not like, oh, they have this and then I have this. They don't understand this, or I don't understand this about them. You become a lot more in tune with other people, and you realize like, everyone is just trying to be happy. Everyone is just trying to avoid that fear of death. And it comes out differently for other people. And so certain people have advantages and disadvantages and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, we are all the same. We are all one. We're all moving towards the same kind of end destination, if that makes sense. We're all just going to continue this cycle of life and keep moving forward. And when you think about it that way, it's obviously going to make you a lot less lonely. At least for me, it made me a lot less lonely, because I realized like there is no distinction or separation between me and other people. Like we all are one. It's a very powerful and, just strong feeling that you get. And it is hard to explain these things kind of in words. This is a very experiential thing. Like you have to, sit down and really experience these feelings yourself, come to these realizations yourself. But my aim with these videos is to help other people maybe understand some of these topics a little bit better, because it was hard for me to understand a lot of these topics. So I want to break them down in a way that may be a little bit easier to understand. So to summarize this video, death is not really as a solid of a point as we kind of think it is. Death isn't something that you need to be terrified of. It doesn't need to be this thing that's an ending. It is just a part of the process. It's not a definitive hard stop. And that makes death a little bit easier to grapple with in day-to-day life. And you can use this easier understanding of death in order to help ease things like anxiety. You no longer feel like you have to make the most of this life. You have to do everything perfectly and the best and feel this immense pressure. You can just let go and truly experience life as it is in its full beauty. So I hope this video helps. Thank you. Take care.